Join Boise State Public Radio for a concert with blues guitarist and vocalist Coco Montoya at the Treefort Music Hall in Boise, February 13th. This concert is in honor of longtime KBSU DJ Arthur Ballinger, who is retiring after 47 years. Doors at 6, concert at 7 on the 13th of February for a night with Coco Montoya at the Treefort Music Hall. Details at boisestatepublicradio.org.
More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudet. President Trump and key members of his administration are attacking judges who are blocking some of his second-term agenda, suggesting that judges do not have the authority to question Trump's executive power. And over the weekend, Vice President J.D. Vance suggested that a president has the power to ignore a court order. However, is that constitutional? Is it even legal? Dr. David Adler, Executive Director of the Alturas Institute, will be holding his next constitutional conversation this Thursday on Lincoln's birthday, his constitutional advice for presidential power in Trump 2.0. Dr. Adler is joining us now with a preview. Hi, Dr. Adler.
Hello, nice to see you again, Gemma. Thanks for having me.
It is our pleasure. So, Dr. Adler, in your next edition of Constitutional Conversations, which will happen this coming Thursday, you'll be exploring the first weeks of President Trump's exercise of executive power. And you're looking at it through the lens of the advice and as you say, the continuing relevance of Abraham Lincoln's address back in 1838. So in that address, what did Lincoln say that you believe resonates in 2025?
Thank you, Gemma. Well, first of all, Lincoln was just 28 when he delivered that magisterial address at the Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois, and he was concerned to defend the rule of law and to maintain checks and balances. What occasioned the talk was the fact that an abolitionist had been murdered by a gang, and he was very alarmed that violence was overtaking the law all across the country. And so he decided in that talk that it was important to defend the rule of law against mob violence, and along the way began to broaden his remarks to speak to the need to constrain ambitious and talented men whose interests may outrun the limited powers and responsibilities of their office. And he said that in America, we could have a Napoleon, we could have a Caesar come to power. And the question was how to prevent that. And he explained that there were responsibilities incumbent upon all officers to maintain the limits imposed by the Constitution on the various offices of the government, that in addition, checks and balances had to be protected and exercised, and that there was a responsibility on the part of the citizenry, Gemma, to not only become more knowledgeable about the Constitution and the laws, but to take them so seriously that it becomes almost a religion for Americans, because he thought the way to freedom and limited government and the protection of rights and liberties lay in the defense of the rule of law and adherence to institutional responsibilities. And so this became a soaring message for Lincoln throughout his career, and it provides us, I think, with insight into how all presidents or members of Congress, for that matter, ought to behave at any juncture in American history. But it strikes me that this is a very critical juncture, and Lincoln's advice resonates as we think about the ambitions, for example, of President Donald Trump to circumvent laws, to ignore regulations, to, in effect, dare to defy court orders as he seeks to promote his agenda. And it's also, I think, a resonating idea for Americans all across the country as they contemplate exactly how are we going to defend our Constitution and maintain our democracy and continue to press forward with the idea that America is at its best when we protect the rights and liberties of all Americans and insist on governmental adherence to the rule of law.
And as you put it, Lincoln believed that the great threat to American democracy and constitutionalism would not come from abroad. It would not come from outside of the US, but from what he called actors on the home front. Can you explain what he meant by threats to the republic from within?
Yeah, what he had in mind was precisely what the founders had in mind, that America would be able to defend itself from efforts to overtake our country by force. And Lincoln waxed on eloquently about our ability to defend our homeland, that Americans would rise to the need to protect our nation from foreign invasion. But he, like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and others, believed, in fact, that the greatest threat to American democracy and constitutional government, and more broadly, our rights and liberties, lay in domestic threats, the efforts by governmental officials to outrun their own limited powers to pursue their agendas, which weren't necessarily well grounded in the powers vested in their office. And he pointed out that no man with great ambition or talent is content to live by limited powers, but wants to exceed those at every turn. And so his point was that people in governmental positions are in a prime position to threaten our constitutional order simply by circumventing the laws and the rules. And that was an idea that stretched all the way back to the founding period, and indeed to James Madison, who said in the convention and wrote in the Federalist Papers that people who hold political power have a great appetite for more power, and it's hard to satisfy that tremendous appetite. The more power they have, the more they want. And when you combine that ambition with the control over the levers of power, that can be a lethal threat to American democracy. And so that's what Lincoln was talking about, and how we all need to rise to the occasion to protect our constitutional system, which is today, I think, under assault.
With that said, President Lincoln had some ideas, some remedies to offer to try and stop the efforts of anyone in office who would abuse powers really for their own gain. Can you talk to us about some of those remedies that he offered?
Yes, he had in mind the idea that civic education was very important, that education about the law and the Constitution should be treated with the kind of respect that we reserve for religious teachings. American law should be revered as the national religion, as Lincoln put it. But beyond civic education and persuading Americans of just how important the rule of law is to the American citizenry in everyday life, that there was a need to preach adherence to the doctrine of checks and balances, so that, in fact, people in office who were inclined to protect the Constitution would have within their grasp the kinds of tools and mechanisms to restrain a usurpacious president, for example. And this meant that ordinary citizens would have to pressure their representatives in the House and the Senate to contain a president who was trying to aggrandize power, or other officials who were trying to circumvent rules and laws for their own self-interest. So the point here is that in American democracy, it is our system. And it always reminds me, of course, of what Benjamin Franklin said at the adjournment of the Constitutional Convention when he was approached by a woman on the street who asked him, "Tell us, Dr. Franklin, what kind of a government have you given us? A monarchy or republic?" And of course, he famously replied, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And that's the stern reminder to all of us, Gemma, that we are responsible for defending the republic at any juncture in American history. And if we don't assume that responsibility, if we don't pick up the cudgels, so to speak, then we've lost the republic. And the loss is on our shoulders. The blame is on us, to borrow from Franklin's reasoning. And why would Americans abandon republicanism or democracy in favor of some system that is hostile to government of, by, and for the people?
So, in your opinion, Dr. Adler, how would you say that these remedies apply to the first weeks of this new Trump administration?
Well, that's an important question, Gemma. Thank you. The reality here is that as President Trump has issued a blizzard of executive orders in the first couple weeks of his second term, at a dizzying pace, of course, that it's been hard for Americans to keep track of exactly what he's been up to. And that's part of his strategy, of course, to flood the zone, as they say. And so the first line of defense from a constitutional perspective would be the reaction of Congress, that Congress, which is seeing its powers trampled upon by this freshly minted administration, would, in the view of James Madison and the founders and Abraham Lincoln, be keen to assert the doctrine of checks and balances, that they would essentially find the ambition to counteract the ambition of the Trump administration so as to defend their own turf, their own Article 1 powers over the power of the purse, for example, or the authority to make rules and laws governing immigration, and that they would push back at efforts essentially to rewrite the Constitution and to remake American government. That would be the first line of defense, Gemma, but we've not seen that. In fact, what we have seen, tragically, is capitulation by the majority party in the House and the Senate, which, of course, is the Republican Party, which is in thrall to Donald Trump. And so instead of standing up in a resolute manner to defend Article 1 and the institutions of government, to borrow from Lincoln, we see essentially capitulation to the president in a variety of ways. The second line of defense then would be the court system. And here it's certainly true that the courts are holding the line. The courts have fenced off President Trump's efforts to usurp congressional power. And so we've got a number of federal judges across the country who have essentially blocked President Trump's executive orders, listed, at least imposed temporary restraining orders until there are fuller hearings. And so that second line of defense assumes greater importance in light of the fact that the Congress is unwilling to assert its own institutional powers. And finally, the other line of defense, again, to continue with this Lincolnian line of reasoning, is that the American people are beginning to speak up. We've seen rallies, we've seen protests around the country, nothing on the order of the kind of massive protests quite yet that were a commonplace during the first Trump administration. But I think as Americans begin to gather more information, catch their breath, so to speak, in the face of this velocity of executive orders, which is very rapid, then we might see more Americans begin to register their disagreement with the president's actions, at least to this point.
Dr. Adler, this past weekend, President Trump, along with the vice president and a host of their allies, asserted in numerous ways that the courts may not review the exercise of presidential power. So, first question, do you consider this to be a threat to our democracy and to the Constitution? I mean, is this a constitutional crisis?
It is. This is a question of great moment, Jem. It's truly alarming because if the president were to assert the authority to defy court orders, then it would exalt the president above the law and displace the fundamental power that the courts have had, at least ever since Marbury versus Madison in 1803, to serve as the ultimate arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution. And this can't be overlooked because if a president can decide what the inventory of executive power is and what the scope of his own powers happens to be, then he may engage in the most arbitrary, self-serving actions without accountability. That's what this claim, this absurd claim, amounts to. Vice President Vance certainly should know better. He's a graduate of law school, and Marbury versus Madison is typically the very first case that first-year law students encounter in constitutional law. So this is a bold claim for absolute presidential power. And if the presidency cannot be subject to judicial review, then in effect, the president has just replaced the rule of law with arbitrary executive will.
Mm-hmm. So with that said, Dr. Adler, let's talk about the fact that it is very clear in our Constitution that we have three separate but equal branches of government: the executive, the legislative, the judicial. And with these tweets that went out, Vice President Vance, tweeted that courts should not be able to tell a president what to do. I mean, I'm summarizing, but that is basically, what he said. Can you explain for people, frankly, who are not constitutional scholars, that the president doesn't have sole power because of these separate but equal branches?
Yeah, that's a great question. The reality is, as you point out, all three branches consist of limited powers, constitutionally confined powers, and the framers of the Constitution decided how much power to grant to each branch. And Congress is the first branch of government, according to James Madison, because as he wrote, in a republic, the legislature necessarily predominates. So when our listeners pull up the Constitution, they'll see that the by far the greatest number of powers belonging to the federal government are granted to Congress. The president's powers listed in Article 2 are few and far between in comparison to legislative powers, and the judiciary still fewer powers. And what this distribution of power, what we call the enumeration of powers, reflects is the framers, first, their deep concern about creating a strong executive, because that generation lived in fear of executive power, given their own experience under King George III and their keen reading of history, which suggested to them that executives are prone to aggrandizing or usurping power. And secondly, that the presidency was conceived by the framers, at least, as being created primarily to have an administrator in chief. That was lacking under the Articles of Confederation, which of course preceded our Constitution. And one of the big problems with the Articles of Confederation was there was not an official designated with responsibility to enforce the law. So that's why in Article 2, Gemma, when it provides in clear language that the president shall, quote, take care to faithfully execute the laws of the land, that designation, that command was the primary reason behind the creation of the American presidency. And that's why when Vice President Vance and Elon Musk and now Speaker of the House Mike Johnson say that the courts cannot engage in a review of the president's actions, even if the president, in his own view, is carrying out what he thinks to be justifiable powers, that would free the president from all accountability. And the framers had in mind that the judiciary would be the check on the president, along with these other constitutional offices that we've discussed. And that's why in 1803 in Marbury versus Madison, Chief Justice Marshall said famously, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. The president cannot be the judge of his own powers, the judge of his own cause, because then the president would act without restraint. So the judiciary has always played a very important role, and Vance knows better. In fact, when Vance went on to explain that the courts may not intervene to tell an officer how to conduct a military campaign, or that the courts could not tell the attorney general how to carry out his or her powers, he was failing terribly to remember that historically, number one, the Supreme Court did say in 1804, in a case called Little versus Barame, that the president had violated statutory commands, even though he was conducting a campaign in the course of war, undeclared war with France in 1798, that his orders had exceeded the commands of Congress, which retained a supervisory authority over the president, and therefore his orders were illegal. So in that case, written by Chief Justice Marshall, the court did exactly what J.D. Vance says the courts may not do. So Vance failed that historical test. And on his second example about judicial meddling or judicial review of the Attorney General's actions, he is forgetting the landmark case of United States versus Nixon in 1974, the Watergate tapes case, in which, in fact, the court held that the acting Attorney General, the Solicitor General, Robert Bork's decision to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, was illegal. So there the court was acting to prevent the Attorney General, or a person acting in the name of that office, had in fact acted illegally. So we've got great Supreme Court monuments to the proposition that the courts may in fact superintend presidential action. So that's what is really bizarre, frankly, or impoverished reasoning on the part of Vance and company to deny that the judiciary has this supervisory authority when the framers clearly intended it, and the great constitutional commands have reaffirmed that constitutional grant of authority. And moreover,
and Dr. Adler, I have to cut you off. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you for the conversation. We've been speaking with Dr. David Adler, Executive Director of the Alturas Institute, previewing his upcoming constitutional conversation this Thursday. It will be at the Yonke Center in Boise at 4 p.m. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
Whether Boise State Public Radio brings a smile to your day, some inspiration, or a greater connection to Idaho and the world, we're proud to be here with you. Federal funding, about $1.60 per person annually, helps keep these trusted services strong and accessible to everyone in our community. Learn how you can safeguard local public media stations like ours by visiting protectmypublicmedia.org.